Welcome. Have you ever wondered how a drug could shake one of the richest empires on Earth? Today, we're uncovering the shocking story of the Opium Wars. How addiction, power, and greed collided to change history forever. If you want to explore history like this, hit subscribe and let's get started. 19th century. A world on the edge of change. Steam engines roar in Europe, factories rise, new powers awaken. But far to the east stands a giant, ancient, confident, unshakable. China. An empire that believes time itself bends around it. A civilization with thousands of years of continuity. Luxurious courts, immense cities, scholars, poets, merchants, soldiers. Silk that Europe can't replicate. Tea that Britain cannot live without. Porcelain that is worth its weight in silver. And silver is exactly what China demands. For centuries, foreign merchants kneel at its gates. They come with ships full of goods, but leave with ships full of emptiness. Because China wants nothing they offer. No wool. No clocks. No machinery. No modern wonders. Just silver. And so the silver flows in. Rivers of wealth pour into China. The empire grows richer. Europe grows desperate. But in the palace of the Qing Dynasty, deep behind layers of silk curtains and ceremonial rites, no one sees the danger growing on the horizon. No one realizes that the world is shifting faster than tradition can hold. No one imagines that an empire so old, so proud, so seemingly eternal, could be broken not by armies or revolutions, but by smoke. A sweet, deadly smoke that fits into a small wooden pipe, and into the cracks of an empire that believed it could not fall. The stage is set. The tragedy hasn't begun, but the first shadow has already entered the room. While China stood firm behind its walls of tradition, Britain faced a crisis it could no longer ignore. The British Empire was expanding, industrializing, consuming more every year. Steamships, factories, railroads, all powered by money, and money needed markets. But there was one market Britain could not penetrate. China. A market of hundreds of millions. A market that bought nothing. A market that drained British silver like a wound that would not close. Tea was the culprit. The British had become addicted to it, culturally, economically, nationally. By the early 1800s, tea made up nearly 10% of all British imports. Every cup poured in London meant more silver pouring into China. And the British treasury was bleeding. Parliament panicked. Merchants complained. The East India Company, the largest corporation on earth, was on the verge of collapse. Britain needed a product China would buy. Something irresistible. Something profitable enough to reverse the silver flow. They tried wool, the Chinese shrugged. They tried manufactured goods, the Chinese laughed. They tried persuasion, the Chinese slammed the door. And so Britain searched for a weakness. A crack in the armor of the Middle Kingdom. They found it in the poppy fields of British-controlled India. A substance cheap to grow. Easy to transport. Powerful enough to turn human wool into ash. Opium. It was not noble. It was not moral. It was not honorable. But it was the answer. Britain did not need China's permission. It only needed China's addiction. And so the decision was made, quietly, ruthlessly, strategically. If China will not trade with Britain, Britain will change what China desires. The drug that would cripple an empire was already growing under a burning Indian sun. The plan started quietly. No declarations. No banners. No armies. Just crates. Unmarked. Unimportant looking. Packed onto swift British ships leaving Calcutta, slipping across the Indian Ocean toward China's southern coast. Inside those crates lay the seeds of collapse. dark brown cakes of opium, cheap to produce, cheap to transport, but capable of rewriting the fate of millions. Britain didn't introduce opium to China. It already existed there, in medicine, in tiny doses, used by healers and herbal doctors. Harmless in moderation. Controlled. Contained. But the British had no interest in moderation. They needed volume. They needed dependency. They needed China to crave, to buy, to fall. And so they industrialized the drug trade. Fields of poppies covered Bengal like blood-red oceans, harvested by poor farmers working under a relentless sun. The crops were taxed, bought, processed, packed, shipped, under the supervision of the East India Company. An empire inside an empire, with its own army, its own ports, its own laws. This was not random smuggling. This was a system. A machine built for one purpose: to turn addiction into revenue. When the opium reached China, it entered through the cracks. The corrupt harbor officials, the desperate merchants, the fishermen willing to risk everything for silver. Small boats met British ships offshore in the black of night. Bargains were whispered in the dark. Chests were unloaded in silence. And by dawn, the drug had already begun its journey inland. Into the villages. Into the markets. Into the homes. Into the lungs. At first, only a few smoked. Then a few thousand. Then hundreds of thousands. Opium dens spread like shadows. Dim rooms filled with bodies lying motionless on bamboo beds. Eyes half closed. Faces melting into blissful vacancy. Smoke hung in the air like a fog of forgetting. Forgetting hunger. Forgetting sorrow. Forgetting responsibility. Forgetting time. Farmers ignored their fields. Laborers skipped their shifts. Merchants wasted entire fortunes in quiet corners of the night. And the British watched the numbers rise. Every pipe lit in China meant silver flowing out. Every silver coin lost in China meant silver flowing into British pockets. This was no longer trade. This was extraction. Economic warfare disguised as pleasure. But the most dangerous part: China didn't see the full picture yet. Officials reported some smuggling, nothing serious. Provincial governors complained of local problems, nothing alarming. The imperial court, insulated by ceremonies and walls of jade, believed China too large, too strong, too ancient to be harmed by a foreign vice. Empires rarely fall because they are struck from the outside. They fall because something rots within. And in China, that rot had already begun. Quiet. Slow. Steady. A single pipe at a time. The Qing court still believed in its own invincibility. But beneath the surface, far beneath the polished floors of the Forbidden City, the empire was cracking. Not loudly. Not suddenly. But the way mountains crumble. Grain by grain. Stone by stone. Quietly, until one day the whole face collapses. And in China, the collapse began in the places the emperor would never see. The people who stopped working. Opium does not strike like a sword. It dissolves discipline, purpose, and responsibility. Slowly. Softly. Like warm water wearing down a stone. In the countryside, farmers who once woke before sunrise stopped tending their fields. A single pipe in the morning became 2, then 3. The land dried. Harvest shrank. Families starved. In bustling cities, Suzhou, Guangzhou, Nanjing, shopkeepers left their stalls unattended for hours. Artisans stopped finishing their orders. Boatmen slept on docks instead of rowing. Entire neighborhoods slipped into a fog of apathy. When addiction spreads, the first thing that dies is productivity. An empire built on millions of hands suddenly found those hands too numb to work. The money that vanished. Silver, the lifeblood of China's economy, began pouring out of the country like water from a broken dam. Before opium, China absorbed the world's silver. During opium, China bled silver at unprecedented speed. Peasants sold heirlooms for another pipe. Merchants paid smugglers in silver ingots. Corrupt officials took bribes in silver coins and sent them up the chain. By the 1830s, the treasury noticed the drain. Prices fluctuated. Taxes faltered. Salaries of imperial officials were delayed. Every nation has a number it cannot afford to lose. China passed that number silently. And when an empire's economy breaks, it doesn't shatter, it buckles. The moral fabric tears. Opium didn't just poison bodies. It poisoned hierarchies. Sons stole from fathers. Wives sold family possessions. Officials took bribes openly. Generals smoked before meetings. Teachers arrived at schools late, or not at all. Confucian order, which had held China steady for centuries, began to erode. Harmony turned into indulgence. Duty turned into distraction. Society turned inward, chasing pleasure instead of progress. An empire can survive corruption. It can survive poverty. It can survive foreign rivals. But it cannot survive when its own people stop believing in the principles that hold it together. The emperor who didn't know. In Beijing, the Daoguang emperor tried to rule a nation he no longer fully understood. Reports reached him, vague, minimized, censored. Some smuggling. A minor issue. An isolated habit. No one dared tell him the truth. That millions were already addicted. That coastal provinces were drowning in narcotic smoke. That British ships controlled the trade routes far better than the empire itself. The emperor sensed something was wrong, deeply wrong. But he could not yet see the scale of the disaster. A sickness hidden in the body is always the hardest to diagnose. The British calculate their moment. Meanwhile, British merchants observed China's decay with cold, mathematical precision. The demand for opium soared. Profits skyrocketed. The trade routes stabilized. And every year, more Chinese smokers entered the market. To Britain, this was not greed. It was strategy. A way to balance global trade, strengthen imperial power, and fund their military-industrial expansion. To China, it was invisible warfare. To history, it would become a crime of staggering proportions. And so the question no one dared ask was forming in the air. What happens when a nation realizes that a foreign power is deliberately poisoning it? The answer would ignite a confrontation that would shake the world. For years, corruption, addiction, and denial had wrapped China in a suffocating fog. The emperor sensed the darkness growing but lacked a blade sharp enough to cut it open. Until one man stepped forward. A man whose name would echo across history. Lin Zexu. The rise of an unusual official. Lin Zexu was not born into power. He was not a noble, not from a military family, not a court favorite groomed for high office. He was something far more dangerous to corruption. A scholar who believed in justice. A strategist who believed in discipline. A man who believed an empire could still save itself. He rose through the examination ranks by sheer brilliance, defeating thousands with his writing, logic, and iron character. He governed provinces with a reputation so clean that even his enemies admitted it. And when news of opium reached him, he reacted not with caution, but with fury. This was not a local issue. This was not the people's weakness. This was a national emergency. A poison. A weapon. And Lin Zexu was determined to face it head-on. His first act, understand the enemy. Before striking, Lin studied. He traveled through villages and cities, speaking to the addicted, the ruined, the grieving. He visited the dens, dark, dirty rooms filled with motionless bodies. He questioned merchants. He interrogated smugglers. He analyzed trade routes, bribe patterns, smuggling networks, British tactics. What he discovered chilled him. Opium wasn't just a drug. It was a system. A pipeline. A foreign-controlled shadow economy that reached from India to Canton to the heart of Beijing. This was not weakness. This was infiltration. The letter that shook the imperial court. Lin Zexu wrote a memorial to the emperor. A document so bold, so clear, so uncompromising, that it shook the forbidden city to its core. He declared, "Opium is a poison that destroys our country. If we do not act, we will lose our wealth. We will lose our people. And we will lose our future." He demanded unprecedented authority. Stop the trade. Purge corruption. Punish dealers. Confront the foreigners. It was not a request. It was an ultimatum. And the emperor, realizing the scale of the crisis at last, gave him full power. Lin Zexu became the empire's spear. The crackdown begins. He moved with lightning precision. Officials who had been bribed, removed. Smugglers who had grown bold, arrested. Opium dens, raided and demolished. Addicts, forced into rehabilitation. Tens of thousands jailed. Hundreds of thousands of pipes confiscated. Millions of addicts forced to undergo withdrawal, violently, painfully, publicly. For the first time in years, the empire fought back. But Lin Zexu was not satisfied with cutting branches. He wanted to strike the root. The foreign dealers. The British. He summoned them to Canton. He demanded they surrender every chest of opium in their warehouses. Not sell. Not move. Surrender. And what he did next would ignite the first global drug war in history. The year was 1839. Summer heat pressed against the southern coast of China. Humidity clung to the air. But the real tension, thick, heavy, electric, came not from the weather, but from the confrontation now unfolding in Canton. Lin Zexu had drawn a line. Clear. Uncompromising. Unavoidable. All opium must be surrendered. No exceptions. No negotiations. And for the first time, the British found themselves staring at a Chinese official who would not bow, would not stall, would not be bribed, coerced, or intimidated. The British merchants trapped. When Lin Zexu issued his order, British merchants panicked. Some tried to hide their stockpiles. Some attempted to bribe intermediaries. Some begged for more time. None succeeded. Lin Zexu surrounded the foreign factories, those walled compounds where British traders lived and stored their goods. He cut off the flow of food. He blocked communication. No one in, no one out. It was a siege, polite in words, but absolute in execution. Inside, Charles Elliot, the British superintendent of trade, felt the full weight of the crisis. He realized what most merchants didn't yet understand. This was no longer a trade dispute. This was a sovereignty challenge. A collision between two empires. Elliot knew that resisting openly would mean immediate arrest, or worse. So he made a decision that shocked even his own men. He ordered full surrender of the opium. Not because he wanted to obey China, but because he believed that such a massive confiscation would give Britain the political ammunition to justify war. 20,000 chests, the mountain of a drug empire. For weeks, chests were dragged out of warehouses. Chest after chest after chest. Each one weighing over 60 kilograms. Each one worth a fortune. Across the Pearl River Delta, crowds gathered to watch. They whispered. They stared. They realized, perhaps for the first time, the sheer scale of addiction imported into their homeland. By the end, the pile was unbelievable. 20,283 chests of opium, the entire British inventory in China. It was one of the largest drug seizures in human history, and it was about to become one of the most dramatic destructions ever witnessed. The Great Destruction at Humen. Lin Zexu ordered the opium transported to a trench dug near the town of Humen. The trench stretched like a scar across the earth. Hundreds of laborers filled it with salt, lime, and water. Guards lined its edges. Officials watched silently. British traders, helpless, stood at a distance. For 23 days straight. The chests were broken open. The opium dumped. The mixture stirred and dissolved into a black, bitter slurry that flowed into the sea, rendered permanently unusable. The value of the destroyed drug? Equivalent to billions in today's currency. But for Lin Zexu, the destruction was not about money. It was about sovereignty, dignity, control. He wrote in his diary, "Heaven sees this act. The people need this justice." A moment of victory, and the shadow behind it. China felt triumphant. Finally, someone had stood up to the foreign smugglers. Finally, action had been taken. Finally, the empire had drawn a boundary that could not be crossed. But victory has two faces. Because on the seas, across the world, in London, the reaction was very different. The British public was outraged. Merchants demanded compensation. Politicians demanded revenge. The East India Company demanded protection of its interests. Newspapers framed the destruction as an attack on British property, an insult to national pride, and a justification for retaliation. The match had been lit. The fuse was burning. And both empires were now on a collision course that would reshape global history. War was no longer a question. It was an approaching storm. The destruction of the opium was meant to end the crisis. Instead, it became the spark that set the world on fire. In London, outrage spread faster than truth. Reports arrived stripped of context, swollen with nationalism. Parliament heard that British merchants had been imprisoned, that British property, worth millions, had been destroyed, that China had insulted the crown. No one mentioned addiction. No one mentioned the smuggling. No one mentioned that the property in question was illegal narcotics. Facts were inconvenient. Narrative was everything. The British government saw an opportunity. The East India Company saw profit. Merchants smelled revenge. And newspapers fed the public a simple, emotional message. China humiliated Britain. Britain must respond. Across the ocean, in China, the mood was entirely different. Lin Zexu wrote triumphant letters to the emperor, claiming that the crisis had been resolved. The smugglers subdued. The drug eradicated from Chinese shores. The emperor believed him. He wanted to believe him. After years of decline and confusion, this felt like a moment of clarity. A moment where the empire finally stood its ground. But neither Lin nor the emperor understood the scale of the storm now forming beyond the horizon. China had dealt with pirates, rebels, nomadic raids, but never with an industrial empire armed with steamships, iron cannons, and a worldview built on expansion. While China celebrated a moral victory, Britain prepared a military expedition. Warships were being loaded. Troops were being assembled. Artillery was being calibrated. Letters were being written authorizing force if diplomacy failed. And diplomacy, everyone knew, was only a formality. In Canton, rumors swirled. Merchants talked nervously. Local officials whispered. Fishermen claimed they had seen strange silhouettes on the horizon. Long, dark shapes that moved impossibly fast. And yet life continued. Markets bustled. Boats drifted along the Pearl River. Tea houses filled with conversation. The empire, vast and ancient, moved forward as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Irreversibly. Two worlds with opposite beliefs. One convinced of its moral superiority. The other convinced of its civilizational centrality. Were now being pulled toward conflict as if by gravity. At night, in the quiet hours before dawn, Lin Zexu stood on the shores of Canton, looking out at the dark, endless sea. He believed he had saved China. He did not yet know that ships were already on their way to make him the man who triggered a war he could never control. The first sign of the coming disaster was sound. A deep, distant thunder rolling across the coastline. Not from the sky, but from machines China had never seen before. British steamships appeared on the horizon like creatures from another world. Huge, dark hulls. Tall iron masts. Smokestacks vomiting black clouds into the sky. They moved against the wind. Against the tide. Against every rule Chinese sailors had trusted for centuries. Fishermen stood frozen in their boats, watching as the ships passed silently through the waves, leaving trails of foam in their wake, and fear in every heart that witnessed them. China had warships too. Wooden junks with patched sails, outdated cannons, and crews trained for river battles, not modern naval warfare. These ships looked almost gentle compared to the iron monsters now approaching. The British fleet did not come to negotiate. They came to demonstrate power, technology, inevitability. In Canton, tension thickened. Local officials pretended not to panic. Merchants spread rumors. Sailors deserted their posts. Families fled inland, carrying bundles of clothes and children half asleep. Within the British ranks there was no uncertainty. They had clear orders. Protect British interests. Demand compensation for the destroyed opium. Force China to open its ports. And use necessary force if resistance appeared. Everyone knew what necessary force meant. When the first envoy approached Canton, he delivered Britain's demands with the calm confidence of a man who knew the answer didn't matter. China refused. Of course China refused. For centuries the empire had dictated the rules of foreign trade. It would not bow now. Not to barbarians. Not to merchants. Not to anyone. But the world had changed. And China had not. The British officers returned to their ships. Commands were issued. Cannons were primed. Flags were raised. The storm China believed it had avoided was about to break open, with a violence it had never experienced. Night fell over Canton like a dark curtain. But the silence did not last long. Just before dawn, the British fleet moved into position. Steam engines churned. Anchor chains rattled. Cannons protruded from iron-plated hulls like rows of cold, metallic eyes. When the first shot rang out, the sound split the sky. Windows shattered in nearby villages. Birds scattered. Children woke screaming. The earth itself seemed to tremble. China's coastal forts responded. But their cannons were old. Their powder damp. Their range too short. Shells splashed harmlessly into the water, long before reaching the enemy. The British shells, however, hit their targets with terrifying precision. Walls cracked. Wood splintered. Smoke clouds swallowed entire sections of the shore. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration of superiority. Industrial power against pre-industrial defense. Chinese soldiers fought bravely. But bravery cannot stop iron. Lines broke. Units scattered. Commanders shouted orders no one could hear over the noise of exploding shells. By midday, the forts protecting Canton were in ruins. By evening, British Marines landed on shore, marching through smoke-filled air with disciplined, mechanical steps. Drums beat. Flags waved. Their formation was tight. Their rifles clean. Their confidence unshaken. Canton's defenders realized something horrifying. The enemy could strike whenever it chose, wherever it chose, with a power no Chinese general had ever witnessed. Reports rushed to Beijing. Enemy ships unstoppable. Artillery unmatched. Troops disciplined. Forts destroyed in hours. The Daoguang Emperor read the messages with disbelief. This could not be happening. Not to China. Not to the Middle Kingdom. Not to the empire that considered itself the center of the world. But the truth was undeniable. China had entered a war it was not prepared to fight. A war against machines, industry, and modern tactics. A war where tradition was a disadvantage. Where isolation had become a weakness. Where pride would soon collide with reality. And this was only the beginning. As news of the defeats spread, the Qing court fell into confusion. Officials argued. Reports contradicted each other. No one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. So messages arrived softened, filtered, twisted into something the emperor might accept without anger. The truth was always delayed. And when truth is delayed, disaster accelerates. The Daoguang Emperor demanded explanations. How could the coastal forts fall so quickly? How could a handful of foreign ships defeat an empire of millions? How could the barbarians wield weapons that seemed like magic? No one had answers. Or rather, no one dared give the real ones. China's military was trapped in another era. Armies were underfunded. Generals appointed by birth rather than skill. Equipment outdated. Strategies centuries old. The Qing state wasn't built for a modern war. It was built to maintain order, collect taxes, and suppress uprisings within its borders. Foreign invasion? Industrial firepower? Steam-powered fleets? These were threats the empire had never seriously imagined. Still, the emperor tried to maintain control. He sent new commanders. He issued urgent decrees. He demanded resistance. But China was too vast. The bureaucracy too slow. The chain of command too tangled. By the time orders traveled from Beijing to the front, British ships had already moved on to their next target. Local officials scrambled to negotiate, sending messages to the British with offers of limited trade, symbolic payments, or promises to punish smugglers. The British rejected everything. They wanted open ports. They wanted full diplomatic equality. They wanted repayment for the destroyed opium. They wanted a treaty that would reshape Asia. Negotiation was never the real plan. The real plan was to force China into the modern world, on British terms. And so the war marched forward, not because China chose it, but because Britain no longer needed China's consent. The illusion of control was disappearing, and the emperor, for the first time in his life, felt the weight of an empire slipping through his fingers. As the British fleet advanced north, city after city braced itself, unsure whether diplomacy or destruction would arrive first. Jinhai was supposed to stand firm. It was a fortified port, strategically placed, with soldiers stationed along the coastline, and cannons mounted on stone battlements. The city believed it was ready. It wasn't. Before dawn, British ships drifted into view. Silent silhouettes gliding across the water. No warnings. No signals. Just cold, precise movement. Chinese lookouts lit the alarm fires, and drums thundered through the night. Soldiers scrambled into position. Families ran for shelter. Local officials shouted orders that drowned in the chaos. Then the first British broadside erupted. The shockwave hit the fort like a physical force. Stone cracked. Dust billowed. Cannons toppled from their mounts. Chinese gunners returned fire. But their shots bounced harmlessly off iron hulls, or splashed into the waves. Within minutes, British shells found the powder storage beneath the fort. The explosion lit up the sky. A white-hot flash that sent debris raining over the city. Panic spread. Units broke formation. Some soldiers fled. Others fought desperately. But the line could not hold. On the water, British ships maneuvered with clinical precision. Steam engines allowing them to cut across currents that Chinese ships depended on. On land, Marines disembarked, advancing behind volleys of disciplined rifle fire. Every step they took tightened the noose around Jinhai. By midday, the defense collapsed. Officials begged for mercy. Gates were opened. Flags lowered. Jinhai, the city that believed it was prepared, fell in a single day. The message to China was unmistakable. The old ways could not protect them. Not their walls. Not their cannons. Not their traditions. And in Beijing, when word of the defeat arrived, the emperor closed himself in silence. He understood now that this was no border dispute, no misunderstanding, no temporary conflict. This was a war China could not win, with the world as it was. And yet the British fleet was still advancing. Toward Shanghai. Toward the Yangtze. Toward the heart of the empire. As British forces pushed deeper along the coast, they reached the gateway that would change the entire war. The mouth of the Yangtze River. The Yangtze was not just a river. It was an artery of the empire. Through it flowed grain, silk, taxes, trade, and life itself. Any army that controlled the Yangtze could control the economic heart of China, and the British knew this. Their steamships slipped into the river like blades, cutting through water that Chinese fleets struggled to navigate. Where Chinese ships relied on wind and tide, British vessels relied on engines. Unstoppable, untiring, indifferent to nature. Villagers along the riverbanks watched in stunned silence as iron ships roared past their farms and rice paddies, moving against the current with an ease that felt unnatural. Cities upriver panicked. Local governments collapsed into chaos. Some officials fled. Others begged Beijing for reinforcements that would never arrive. For the Qing court, this was a nightmare scenario. The empire's greatest weakness was geography. Beijing was far from the coast, far from the river, far from every major battle. By the time orders traveled north to south, the British had already advanced to the next city, Nanjing, Wuhu, Zhenjiang. One by one, they fell or surrendered. The Yangtze Corridor, once a symbol of imperial stability, became a highway for foreign gunboats. With every mile the British advanced, the emperor's control shrank. Grain shipments stopped. Markets collapsed. Communication lines broke down. The British didn't need to conquer all of China. They only needed to choke its lifelines. And now, those lifelines were slipping entirely into their hands. The city of Nanking was one of China's ancient capitals. A place of scholars, poets, gardens, and imperial memory. It symbolized culture, history, and continuity. But in 1842, it became something else entirely. The place where China realized the war was lost. When British ships appeared outside the city, the sight alone shattered morale. Residents climbed tower walls and saw iron vessels floating where no foreign ship had ever dared to go. The impossible had happened. The heart of the empire was exposed. Inside Nanking, debates turned desperate. Some officials insisted on fighting to the end, dying with honor rather than bowing to foreign demands. Others argued that continued resistance would doom millions to famine and ruin. But the British didn't wait for them to decide. Their cannons were positioned. Their troops marched toward the walls. A siege was inevitable. Then word arrived that froze the entire court. Zhenjiang had fallen. Not just fallen, but with catastrophic losses. City defenses overwhelmed. Civilians caught in the chaos. The road to Nanking now wide open. It was the final blow. Negotiation became unavoidable. The Qing Dynasty, the same dynasty that once believed itself the center of the world, was now forced to sit at the table of a foreign power that came by steam and gunfire. Envoys met in a small, humid pavilion outside the city. British officers stood confidently, their uniforms immaculate, their weapons gleaming. Chinese officials arrived pale, exhausted, their silk robes stained with sweat from the August heat, and from the unbearable weight of history collapsing on their shoulders. The British dictated the terms. China listened. Open 5 ports to foreign trade. Grant extraterritorial rights. Pay a massive indemnity. Cede Hong Kong. Promise equal diplomatic treatment. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a list of consequences. For the first time in its long history, China signed a treaty under threat of annihilation. A treaty not of mutual agreement, but of survival. The Treaty of Nanking didn't just end the First Opium War. It opened a century of humiliation, foreign domination, and internal collapse. As the ink dried, Chinese officials lowered their heads. British officers saluted briskly. And outside on the river, the iron ships waited. Silent reminders of the world China was now forced to enter. The ink on the Treaty of Nanking was barely dry, but its consequences echoed through China like thunder. 5 ports were opened: Canton, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen, allowing foreign powers to flood the markets with their goods, their influence, their law. China's centuries-old system of trade, carefully controlled and guarded, was shattered in an instant. Hong Kong, once a quiet fishing island, was handed over to Britain. A small dot on the map turned into a symbol of foreign domination. A foothold that would grow into a global trading empire. The massive indemnity, 21 million silver dollars, drained the imperial treasury, forcing China to raise taxes and tighten control over its own people. The government tried to suppress news of the defeat, but whispers spread in markets and tea houses. China, the Middle Kingdom, was wounded, badly. Pride was crushed. Faith in the dynasty weakened. The social order trembled. Yet the opium trade did not end. It exploded. Addicts returned in greater numbers. Dens reopened. Smuggling intensified. The British had not just won a war. They had opened the floodgates for a century of struggle. For China, the First Opium War was not just a military defeat. It was a painful awakening. The beginning of a long, bitter fight to reclaim sovereignty, to modernize, to survive. The First Opium War ended, but its shadow stretched far into the future. It revealed the brutal cost of addiction, not only to individuals, but to nations. It exposed the vulnerability of ancient empires. When confronted with industrialized, ruthless colonial powers, it shattered the illusion that China was untouchable, forcing a painful reckoning with a rapidly changing world. The war planted the seeds for internal rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion. As millions resisted the collapse of their society, and the foreign presence. It forced China to confront modernization, military, economic, political, and ignited debates that would shape its path into the 20th century. The legacy of the Opium Wars is a story of tragedy and resilience. A story of how a drug, born in foreign fields, smuggled across seas, and burned on Chinese soil, could fracture an empire, ignite a global conflict, and change the course of history forever. This is not just a tale of smoke and gunfire. It is a warning, a lesson, a reminder that empires fall not only from conquest, but from the corrosive power of addiction, greed, and denial. That's the story of the Opium Wars, a powerful reminder of how addiction, greed, and empire collide with devastating consequences. If you found this video eye-opening, smash the like button and share it with your friends. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's most gripping moments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.